Welcome. I am Kirsten Carter, Head Archivist at the FDR Presidential Library. Thank you for joining us for the 17th Annual Roosevelt Reading Festival and the most recent installment of the FDR Presidential Library's At Home with the Roosevelts virtual programming series. We're excited to bring the program back this year and look forward to reviving our traditional format in 2022. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Jarboe Russell. Please join us for some Q&A in the YouTube chat following the presentation. Jarboe Russell is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Train to Crystal City, FDR's secret prisoner exchange program and America's only family internment camp during World War II. Winner of the Texas Institute of Letters Prize for Best Book of Nonfiction. She's a Nieman Fellow, a contributing editor for Texas Monthly, and has written for the San Antonio Express News, the New York Times, Slate, and other magazines. She also compiled and edited They Live to Tell the Tale. She lives in San Antonio, Texas, with her husband, Dr. Lewis F. Russell Jr. So let's welcome Jarboe Russell.
Nice to be with you. It's been nice to be with you today, and I have some things I'd like to talk about with you about Eleanor. And I'm calling it Eleanor in the Village to begin with. Inauguration Day, Saturday, March the 4th, 1933, was cold and windy, a blustery blue day in every possible way. The press covered every detail of Eleanor Roosevelt's wardrobe, her blue velvet dress, her hat, also blue, her white kid gloves. After 48 years, Eleanor stood at 5 feet 11 inches, the tallest First Lady in history, only 2 inches shorter than her husband. She was trim and willowy then, her thick blonde hair tucked beneath her cap, her gentle blue eyes not exactly sparkling, but wide open to the world. At 10 a.m., Eleanor and Franklin and their eldest son, James, went to John's Episcopal Church across Lafayette Street Square from the White House. They were greeted by Reverend Peabody, who officiated at Eleanor and Franklin's wedding 28 years before in New York. The irony was not lost on Eleanor, who had not shared her husband's bed for 15 years. Their relationship now was a consuming political partnership, not the love affair it was on their wedding day. Each lived independently from the other, and that day, Eleanor was worried that Franklin's election as president would mark the end of her own independence. Her personal life was hard-won. As much as she shared FDR's ideas and plans for the country's future, she feared she would become a slave to the superficial duties of the First Lady. Before the election, Eleanor confided to her women friends in Greenwich Village that she could not bring herself to live full-time in the White House. So great was her fear that Eleanor confided to these women that she had considered asking Roosevelt for a divorce. She later wrote that she was, quote, deeply troubled, unquote, by the prospect of becoming First Lady. As I saw it, she said, this meant the end of any meaningful personal life of my own. Just before noon, Eleanor and Franklin appeared together on the east portico of the Capitol. With his son's help, Franklin inched his polio legs down the red carpet ramp. The throng of people in the crowd watched in silence out of respect and hope for the newly elected president. Eleanor stood behind Franklin as he was sworn in, and a lady, according to Emma, who was a newspaper person there that day, said that her face was peeled and austere demeanor bore testimony to the solemnity with which she viewed Roosevelt's new position. Many friends watched for an opportunity to wave to her, but not once did she lift her eyes to the crowd or wave her hand or smile. It was a solemn day for both public and private reasons. The country was still in the thick of the Great Depression. The unemployment rate in America on Inauguration Day stood at 25% of the nation's workforce. 40% of the farms in Mississippi were on the auction block. In Harlem, 50% of the people were out of work. Settlement houses in Greenwich Village doled out thin soup to the unemployed. Eleanor had crisscrossed the country and saw the effect of the depressions. Schools closed, coal miners out of work, hobos riding trains, children very hungry. Her feelings were crowded with the country's problems as well as her own private depression. By that day, Eleanor was an independent, strong-willed woman who knew she had her eye on her own. It was as if all the things she had done in the last 2 decades to free herself and develop a sense of identity were about to be torn away from her. She said, "My zest in life is rather gone for the time being," Eleanor wrote to her closest friend, the journalist Lorena Hickok. "If anyone looks at me, I want to weep." Imagine then the wave of relief that Eleanor must have felt a few days later after the inauguration when she stepped onto the wood floors of a house she secretly shared with 2 friends at 20th East 11th Street, a serene tree-lined street just off Fifth Avenue in Greenwich Village. The brownstone was built in the pre-war style. It was 5 stories tall and contained 9 apartments. It was in one of these apartments that Eleanor and her 2 friends, Esther Lappe, a social scientist and political activist, and Elizabeth Reed, an attorney, financial advisor, and Lappe's life partner, formed a 3-way friendship. This became the nucleus of Eleanor's support network. They joined what was then called the New Woman in Greenwich Village of the 20s. Unlike the younger flappers in the village who concentrated on new short hairstyles, short skirts, and red lipstick, and who frequented the speakeasies, the new women had a different, more serious agenda. They organized for social change, unions for workers, equal pay for equal work, protection for child workers, and they insisted on their own sexual freedom. There was never one single moment, and the history of the new women was one of warring factions. They disagreed about politics and political parties. Some, like Eleanor, were Democrats, others Republicans, socialists, and even communists. Many in Eleanor's circles were gay, including Lappe and Reed. Others were spinsters. A phrase in a Freudian handbook in the 20s labeled the new women as frightening deviants, mannish lesbians, for having selfish ambitions, such as an education, a career, and their own sexual preferences. Lappe and Reed were committed to their own freedom and were devoted lovers. They lived outside the blueprint of social dictates and followed instead the rhythm of their own nature. In 1920, Eleanor placed her children, Anna, James, Franklin Jr., Elliot, and John, in the care of nannies, and her domineering mother-in-law, Sarah, in the double townhouse that Sarah owned at 49th East 49th Street in Manhattan. For 4 days of the week, Eleanor moved into the apartment in Greenwich Village that she shared with Lappe and Reed. The escape from her mother-in-law's control was a step towards reclaiming her own life. 2 years before, Eleanor made the move. The marriage of Franklin and Eleanor had been shattered when Eleanor discovered in 1918 Franklin's affair with Lucy Mercer, Eleanor's social secretary. Years later, Eleanor's daughter Anna wrote that her mother's discovery of the affair spurred on her search for personal and emotional freedom, and that her parents' different priorities became more apparent. As the years passed, Eleanor and Franklin each developed separate attachments of friends who offered support. As occurred during the Elizabethan era, when kings and queens had separate courts of power, Eleanor and Franklin developed two competing courts of trusted friends. When Eleanor moved into Greenwich Village in 1920 to share the apartment of Lappy and Reed, she repeated a pattern set during her anguished childhood. On December 7th, 1892, when Eleanor was only 8 years old, her mother died. The following year, her brother died. And the next year, her father, whom she idolized, died of alcoholism. She was, for one and all practical purposes, a wealthy orphan. Eleanor's grandmother sent her to Allenswood, a finishing school in London. At this prestigious school was the daughters of Europe's wealthy. Eleanor fell under the spell of the founder, Madame Marie Souvestre, a French philosopher. Eleanor thrived at the school and became one of Souvestre's favorite students. Souvestre was an early feminist and a lesbian who taught the girls to take their education seriously and to fight for independence. Eleanor was a student of Souvestre for 3 years, and at every turn she was encouraged by Souvestre. Eleanor studied the classics, enjoyed sports, and learned to debate. And she graduated. The two exchanged letters until Souvestre's death in 1905. The bond that she felt provides a fascinating glimpse into what Eleanor held dear. It reveals much about Eleanor's personality, that at Allensworth she was one with other highly cultural women who were intellectual strivers, interested in great books, paintings, opera, and news of the world. Paradoxically, Eleanor's years at Allensworth often offered a kind of normalcy that she had never known, and set herself up to know her own mind. In the days after Eleanor's discovery of the affair between Franklin and Lucy Mercer, Eleanor was very depressed by what was in effect the death of the marriage. She had long lost confidence in herself and was bitter and pent up and very confused about what she would do. When she moved from her mother-in-law's house in Manhattan to the Greenwich Village apartment, she hoped to replicate the life of scholarship and quest for truth that she had when she worked with Souvestre. It was in the Greenwich Village, under the roof of Lappy and Reed at 20th East 11th Street and their tutelage, that Eleanor became the strong, forceful woman that has consistently made her the most popular First Lady in public polls. In light of all the blows she suffered throughout her life, Eleanor's achievements while she was alive and her ongoing population remain proof of the wisdom of her choices. Eleanor took to heart Virginia Woolf's view that the reality of life often overwhelms women and indeed upon their own nature, freezing whatever it touches. As Woolf famously wrote, "So, when I ask you to earn money and have a room of your own, I'm asking you to live in the presence of reality and an invigorating life." Eleanor found that room of her own in Greenwich Village and was indeed invigorating. While many books have been written about Eleanor by historians such as Blanche Wyson-Cook, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Hazel Rowley, and others, Eleanor's years in Greenwich Village have not been fully explored. What makes this book different is that it will bring to life for contemporary readers the history of Greenwich Village between 1920, when Eleanor moved there, and the time of her death in 1962. The context of the book is the history of the village as a backdrop to how Eleanor became the Eleanor we know now. From 1920 until the end of her life, Eleanor was at the center of the political and social mix of Greenwich Village. Here are a few examples. In 1927, she joined a picket line with the Women's Trade Union League, and like the other women, were charged and imprisoned for disorderly conduct. That was Eleanor being disorderly. In 1929, after the stock market crashed, Eleanor helped Marie Marchand, known as Romany Marie, who owned a tavern in the village, serve soup by the Hudson River to hungry people who lived in tents. Romany's tavern was the first on Christopher Street, and it was a fixture of the village. She acted as a concerned mother for many of the writers who listened to their troubles and read their fortunes from the grounds of their Turkish coffee and tea leaves. It was probably the last of the really great bohemian cafes I know of in the world that was said by Buckmaster Fuller, a regular at the time. When she moved to East 11th Street, she did not fit in with the suffragettes who started the campaign for the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which gave women the right to vote. Eleanor had been too concerned with Franklin's political career, so she stayed silent. Once she centered her life in the village, she found her own way to support herself. Starting in 1925, she did her own commercially sponsored radio program. By the 30s, she earned up to $3,000 for a single appearance on the program, an amount roughly worth $50,000 in today's dollars. Isn't it a fact that women have always worked, Eleanor said, often very hard? Did anyone make a fuss about it until they began to be paid for their work? That's what she said. The village was a neighborhood of rogues and outcasts, a zone of bohemians, misfits, and Spencers. But there was a freedom in the village. Eleanor experienced in 1920 what Ross Weston, editor of the Village Voice, captured in his book, Republic of Dreams. The essence of the village was to create a miniature society where personal idiosyncrasies could flourish, wrote Westonson. Even Americans who remain hostile to the village have become fascinated by it because it has become a kind of labor of laboratory in which a nation at once dedicated to militant individualism and middle-class conformity could witness attempts to overcome that paradox. When she moved into the house with Lappy and Reed, she walked into their sanctuary, a hiding place. They lived in a neighborhood filled with feminists. 2 blocks over at 171 West 12th Street was a building where Marion Dickerman and Nancy Cook lived. The 3 women became partners in the Todd Hunter School for Girls in New York City. Eleanor taught American history, American literature, and English at the school until 1928. In that same building lived Molly Dewsum, a powerful leader of the Democratic Party, and Dewsum's partner, Polly Porter. Lappy and Reed had created a world for themselves, and Eleanor soon became part of that world. What Eleanor later described as her emancipation came from the tutelage of Lappy and Reed. Lappy was a graduate of Wellesley, and Reed, who became Eleanor's attorney, was an honors graduate from Smith College and the University of Pennsylvania Law School. They were hardworking women. Together, they published a weekly newsletter of editorials. They had formal dinners in the apartment and wore dashing clothes. Eleanor was sensitive about her clothes and her attire, but Lappy and Reed taught her to think of those things, her clothes especially, as costumes. Esther was extravagant. She wore clothes handmade by her own designer out of silk and satin. In time, Eleanor used Esther's designer and became more confident in her appearance. The three hosted salons and invited other new women neighbors to the apartment. They read the classics and poetry out loud, most of it in French, and listened to music. They talked about this theater, about politics, and organized vigorously for women's rights. Many of Eleanor's causes came of these salons. Her support for the worker state against Fifth Avenue dressmakers, her conviction that the treatment of Black citizens was a moral aberration. Her insistence on equal pay for equal work was for women. Privately, she looked for ways to calm her spirit down. Esther and Elizabeth purchased an estate in Connecticut called Salt Meadow in 1927. Above the door, Elizabeth Reed carved Plato's invocation to God, the Pan. Beloved Pan, give me beauty, the inward soul. In this time, these friendships enriched Eleanor's life. In June 1921, Reed and Lappy stayed for a few days at Hyde Park, the Roosevelt's home on the Hudson River. They never made a secret that they were lesbians. My mother-in-law was very distressed, Eleanor wrote. I had begun to realize that in my development, I was drifting far afield from the old influences. Franklin, on the other hand, was welcoming to both Reed and Lappy. A few days later, the Roosevelt family arrived on Campanile Island, the beautiful, popular retreat for New York and Boston aristocrats. Eleanor and Franklin both loved the isolation of the island. He fished, she walked the coastline, the children sailed in the bay. On Wednesday, August the 10th, Franklin and the children docked the boat after a good day's sail. He went straight to bed, trembling with cold. By the next day, he trembled with fever, 102, and Eleanor sent for the doctor. She thought he had the flu. By Friday, Franklin could not support himself. Eleanor was by his side, and he told her that his skin was so sensitive that he could not stand the pressure of the breeze coming in the window. It was polio. In the following days, Franklin lost control of his bowels. Eleanor was shown by the doctor how to insert a catheter and how to administer an enema. When the doctor told Franklin that his diagnosis was infantile paralysis, she was with him. He showed no emotion. As she said, his reaction to any great event was always to be calm. She wrote, if it was something that was bad, he just became almost like an iceberg. The polio crisis gave Eleanor a chance to show how she could possibly manage to hold on to opposing roles. Her independent life in the village with her role as wife and mother, and later the First Lady. It was not the expected path, but Eleanor managed all three roles, refusing to give up one for the other. Her unauthored lifestyle in the village did not go unnoticed by J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI. The first entry in Eleanor Roosevelt's FBI file, kept by Hoover and the Bureau until the day she died, concerns her activities in February 1923 with Lappe and Reed on behalf of their support of the World Court. FBI agents combed the village and documented their un-American activities on behalf of the court. The file on Eleanor is the largest in the history of the FBI, and much of what it includes happens in the village. For instance, in 1938, Barney Josephine, a black male, opened the Josephine Cafe at 2 Charondy Square in the village. Prohibition was over. Legitimate businessmen like Josephine replaced the criminals of the 20s and as nightclub owners. The goal was a radically integrated nightclub, a place for progressives to go and frequented by Eleanor herself. J. Edgar Hoover's file on Eleanor notes her association with a number of people who were suspicious, according to Hoover. Esther Lappe, Elizabeth Reed, and especially Lorena Hickok, among others. Lorena Hickok and Eleanor Roosevelt first met on Franklin presidential campaign on October 3rd, 1932. Lorraine Hickok, a veteran reporter who worked for the AP and was known simply as Hick. She and Eleanor became acquainted that night on the train. They had so many things in common. Hick had an abusive father. Eleanor had an alcoholic father and a disapproving mother. She also had an overbearing grandmother, and her aunts called her the ugly duckling. As Hick remembered, Eleanor did most of the talking that night, after which Hick asked, "May I print some of that?" Eleanor responded, "If you like, I trust you." Hick and Eleanor became very close friends and frequently traveled together during the Depression to Appalachia and other distressed parts of the country. At that time, Hick was working for the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, where she conducted fact-finding trips. During the war years, Eleanor publicly supported her husband, although privately they had their disagreements. The war years in the 1940s gave rise to a revival in the village after the Depression, and at the same time made New York City the capital of the Western world. The war broke the rhythm of American life, and afterwards it was hard to retrieve it. On April the 12th, 1945, Eleanor was in Washington, D.C. when Franklin died in Warm Spring, Georgia. Eleanor sent for Harry Truman to inform him, and she said, "Harry, the president is dead. Is there anything I can do for you? For you are in trouble now." A widow at 60, Eleanor, like so many other widows, did not know what to do with herself. Joseph Lash and others wanted her to run for governor, senator, or even the presidency. But Eleanor did not believe a woman could win. Eleanor was appointed to the U.S. representatives of the United Nations Commissions on Human Rights by President Truman. She also remained a strong voice behind the scenes in New York and national politics. She and Jane Jacobs successfully opposed Robert Moses' proposal to cut an extension of 50th Avenue through Washington Square, which would have cut the park into 2 isolated strips. She supported Adlai Stevenson for president in 1952 and 1956, realizing it was an uphill battle for him to defeat the very popular Dwight Eisenhower. John F. Kennedy had to convince Eleanor he was the best candidate in 1960, and he finally did so. Eleanor felt he might be too young, and she also disliked his father. In 1960, she was diagnosed with anemia, and yet she remained active. She appeared on the Frank Sinatra show on February the 15th, 1960. She told Frank she was not a singer or a dancer, and she couldn't understand why he had asked her to come on the show. Sinatra asked her what her favorite word was that kept her going. Hope, he said. She said, hope. Without hope, there can be no solution to mankind's troubles, Eleanor replied. Eleanor died November 7th, 1962, and 3 presidents and hundreds of people attended her funeral in Hyde Park. She was buried next to Franklin in the Rose Garden at Hyde Park. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jan. I have a couple questions for you.
Sure.
First, you described the influence of so many important women of the progressive era, the influence on Eleanor Roosevelt and their broader influence on social justice and, the progress that people were making in terms of workplace security and all the things that would kind of lead into what the New Deal was all about. Could you tell me, why do you think that some of those women are not better known?
Well, isn't that interesting? I think some of it is because they were mostly in the village instead of all over the place. And I think, and they stuck to each other for fear that someone would do something bad. And I think that has part of it. And most of these women did not have children, and so they had time to work on what was going to happen. I think that's about as good as I can get. I don't know. That's what I think.
Mm-hmm. What was it that attracted you to Eleanor Roosevelt in particular in this study? Why Eleanor Roosevelt, and what inspired you about her story?
The person who has inspired me about Eleanor Roosevelt, it was my mother, who is long gone, has been gone for a long time. She was a teacher, and she had a lot of other friends that were teachers. And she was watching in Eleanor frequently, and so she had those people in our house, and they would discuss how important Eleanor Roosevelt was to the teachers, and I suppose that that is what happened to me about Eleanor, because I wasn't going to. I wanted my mother to be someone like Mrs. Roosevelt. She wasn't, of course, but she came very close.
That's wonderful. The story of Eleanor Roosevelt is remarkable, as we all know.
Yes.
Do you think that the influence of her time in Greenwich Village should be better understood? And is this like the thing that you'd like us to take away today?
It is for me, because and I think they're having some problems right now in the village because of all that's happened lately. But the village is small. And the people there were a lot of really smart people that came to the village to live, and to be together with other people that were like-minded. And it's a small place, but it has made many beautiful things happen.
Mm.
And for not only for children, for women, for men, and Eleanor Roosevelt was happy there.
That's wonderful. Okay, thank you so much, Jan. That wraps up our talk today. Again, the book is Eleanor in the Village, Eleanor Roosevelt's Search for Freedom and Identity in New York's Greenwich Village. Thank you so much for joining us.